Good evening. I'm Beth Samea, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Interim Program Director in the Information Knowledge Strategy Program here at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. Welcome to Game Time Decision Making in Times of Disruption, the second in our Frame Your Future series. We're here to discuss strategies and structures for successful decision making. I'm excited to have this group joining me. Together, they bring incredible heft to this topic. Moses Hidoko is Chief Knowledge Officer of the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. Diane Gerson is the former Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer for IBM. Ben Royce leads Business Development and Cloud AI Services at Google. He's an alum of the IKNS program here at Columbia, where he also now teaches. Steve Safir is the Interim Program Director and Lecturer in the discipline of the Human Capital Management Program. And Jordan Sims is founding partner at Imperium Global Advisors, and he's a former nuclear-trained submarine officer in the U.S. Navy. He's also a lecturer in the Information Knowledge Strategy Program here at SDS. Welcome to all of you. To our audience, I want to remind you, keep an eye on the chat. Feel free to ask questions or share your insights while we talk about these interesting topics. So let's start with the organizational context. Moses, I want to start with you. The decision-making environment is extreme in many ways at NASA. In particular, the scale and the time frame of some of NASA's projects is massive. Complexity of the project's enormous. So, does agility exist in the context of a multi-billion-dollar NASA project that could take decades to complete?
Wow, that's a good question, Beth. Thank you for this question. First of all, I have to make a full disclosure that I'm taking part in this conversation in my personal capacity and not in my official role as a NASA official. Now, that is out of the way. Let me respond to your question. The complexity of NASA's missions and programs can be understood from the standpoint of a set of metrics. These metrics are often defined by system performance, schedule, cost, and risk management. In fact, it is the interplay of these conflicting set of requirements that informs the complexity of our work. And so we work in an environment of complexity on different fronts, whether dealing with unknown observations on planetary bodies or dealing with decision-making on budget allocations. Agility is present in the NASA environment. We have to be agile on many fronts, including decision-making, in order to achieve mission success. In our environment, agility within decision-making also means being flexible, but always having the system's view of your actions or inactions and decisions. Agility to us means moving efficiently, but also clearly knowing the impact of your decisions on other interface points, project units, subsystems, and overall risk profile, and so on and so forth. In other words, we encourage a well thought out agility in our decision-making within the construct of the overall system of interest. Let me stop right there for the sake of time.
Thank you. All right, so you have to be agile in space. Now let's hear about being agile under the sea. Jordan, a submarine is the definition of extreme environment. You're literally making decisions in the dark. To what extent do you rely on process? And how do you know when to be agile to make a decision based on new information? What information do you have access to, and what don't you have access to?
Yeah, that's a great question, Beth. And to be honest with you, it probably is the best just illustrative context of making decisions in the dark. I will have you know, though, it's at least fluorescent and 70 degrees every day, so it's not totally in the dark. So this is the one nice thing about it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we have no shortage of data coming into us from a myriad of sensors in the submarine environment and that extreme environment, from both inside and around the boat and where we position for our missions and things of that nature. But the thing I want to emphasize is while the data helps us inform what we need to know, it comes down to how the balance between your data processing and data capabilities and your overall vision and leadership style come together to strike the balance that ultimately drives successful courses of action across the board. And I think that's something that can be embodied by kind of remembering that our goal with the data, especially in that environment, is to make as many of the unknowns known so we can analyze our alternatives, weigh our priorities, and we'd have those numerous times where we'd have competing priorities of data coming into us. And the beauty of that was, as a leader, being able to not always allow the data to just blindly allow the team to dictate what their next course of action was going to be. However, it allowed us to process what our current situation was at point A, where we needed to get at point C, and allow the diversity of the input from the team and their own intuitions and their own respective analyses of that data to be able to do that through an intent-based leadership approach, as opposed to just blindly following data, what might be going down the wrong question or the wrong problem. So that's something we took a lot of pride in, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. How has that shaped your approach to decision-making on dry land?
I think it really has, I think for me, and personally, driven a sense of needed personal awareness as you go about how you package decisions within the organization and a team. The packaging is almost as good as the content. All we do as leaders is make decisions. That's all we have to stand on as our work product. And having people understand the why behind the decision, which I'm here, many people read about and hear about, but understanding how they can buy into that decision from a variety of angles is absolutely essential, so that they feel a part of it throughout. And that's that intent-based leadership approach, I think, that we hammer home throughout kind of the naval tradition. That's
so interesting. Diane, IBM is a venerated legacy institution. What aspects of IBM's legacy has the company kept, and what aspects has the IBM culture enabled it to change with the times and stay relevant and cutting edge over 100 years of change? I think you're muted. That's it. That's the of the year.
Diane was the first one. Thank you.
I had to do it. So I would say there were like three things maybe that are enduring that have enabled us to build on what we have, but to continue to change. One is our values, and it goes way, way back to the beginning of the last century when we were hiring women and Blacks into management positions, and declared a equal pay for equal work formal policy in the early 40s, well ahead, of course, of any legislation. And by having that kind of leadership position, it was never a question. You never had to debate, any of the new issues that cropped up over time. And so that made it easy, right? So to be able to, for example, the most recent one being, abandoning facial recognition software as a business, or, putting in place gender transition policies. That was the 2000, we did that. But then in countries where, it's very foreign, like in Thailand or in the Philippines. So, always having a North Star about our values and around diversity and inclusion has just made it easy to keep up, with what's going on in the world. I'd say the second thing is we've never defined ourselves by our products. And that's a huge issue, right? Many companies get stuck with the products that they have. And for us, we've always been defined by our mission, which for decades has been the same, even though we've gone from, sort of meat slicers to typewriters and so forth, that we are no longer part of our business. But it's always a matter of applying technology to what's essential to our clients. And that's enabled us to stay ahead of technology and all the time, and never being complacent about what we have, always being ready to move to the next thing. I'd say the third thing is a culture of curiosity and learning. And that is just deeply embedded in our culture. Innovation is something, when we ask our employees, when you think of IBM, what 3 words do you think of? 96% innovation is one of them, right? So it's just part of who we are, and we hire for curiosity. So building in this need to continue to learn, and we were very clear as we were transforming our portfolio that, look, we expect you to completely unlearn what you know and learn the new stuff. And we led the way at the senior management level. They published what their badges were, the courses they were taking. So no one was too proud to say, hey, I don't know it. You've got to learn this stuff. And so that was, I think, really, really important to enabling us to move into a completely new portfolio and making it more than 60% of our business over 5 years.
That sounds fantastic. So Ben, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Google, which is also huge, but by contrast, it's relatively young compared to IBM. Could you talk about the Google's decision-making culture and its defining characteristics? Would 96% of the employees say the same thing about Google as they say about IBM? And how do Google's norms impact the people's decision-making?
Yeah, no, I mean, the words would probably be something like search and Gmail or something like that, right? So decisions are, as you can imagine, very, very data driven. I've always appreciated data driven decision making. I really appreciated it, seeing how Google did it. And one of the, it's not just that simple as implementing, hey, we're going to use data for decisions. It's much more complex than that. One of the things is that, a single data point is not data. It's barely usable. You have to have context, like the historical context, how the data was collected, under what conditions, from who, sample size, these kinds of things matter. That's pretty easy to kind of set what they call data quality standards. The really interesting part and what helps data decision making is making sure that everyone has access to the underlying data. So this is, the data silos are the enemy here. So this does two things. One is you will get people who analyzing data and coming up with sort of insights or knowledge from that data, who's not their main job to do that, but they are data literate enough and they have the kind of gumption to go out and explore. That's wonderful because they call those unexpected insights. The other benefit of that is that your leaders, your managers, people adjacent to you, people below you in the organizational hierarchy, all can do the same analysis and see if they came to the same conclusion. And you'd be surprised how common it is to do very, very detailed, thoughtful analysis and have two people have two different approaches and come to two different conclusions. This is what leads to the discussion part. So the premise is that data is open and available to everyone, so that not just for verification, but for exploration. The second part is to make sure that everyone has a chance to discuss and bring their piece to the table. This means it's less analysis and more discussion. So it really helps. And I have always appreciated data. I've seen the same data set analyzed hundreds of different ways, and really getting to the root of a problem or the root of a decision that way. And it's like you'd never know how deep the rabbit hole goes until you have hundreds of people all combing over the same information, which is what I imagine a lot of journalists are like that too. So that's a lot of how we do it, and we try to implement that on every level.
And Beth, he hits a really good point there. The access to the data, just to put, and Ben's the guru on this, but in layman's terms and straight talk, having access to who's asking the question, right, is the key illustration of that, I think, because that's the closest point to the problem that leaders rely upon to stay out of their way and let them have access to that data to solve those problems. So that's a great point, Ben, I think.
It is so interesting. So, Steve, we need your insights here. Human capital management deals with organizations, with cultures, with people. What are your thoughts about everything we just heard?
So this is tough, Beth, because I'm happy you called them in. On the other hand, I'd just like to sit here and listen and process all the things that we're hearing. It's fascinating, but we don't have that luxury. So, when I hear Moses talk about things like complexity and conflicting requirements, I'm looking at my notes here. We hear the discussions about data, Diane talking about values, diversity, inclusion, the proud history of IBM. One of the players in this is the individual. So we like to tell our students, one of the core management challenges, maybe the core management challenge over time, and especially now, is that organizations have needs and individuals have needs. And how do we balance that and integrate the need of the individual with the need of the organization so that there's a sweet spot? When we come to decision making, we have to understand that one of the conflicting requirements is me as an individual. So how do I fit into this? How do I fit into the organization structure? What's the culture? Is there a culture of psychological safety? What about my job? What about my career? What am I worried about? Am I going to be second guessed? So the conflicting requirements, the access to data, some of that data is how I myself feel. And it becomes a very complex constellation of decision making for the individual within the structure, and then the structure within the culture.
Does anybody else on the panel want to weigh in on that?
Yes, I think that's an interesting take on the complexity of decision making. It leads into something that I'm very passionate about, which is cultures within cultures. What Steve just touched on is where you end up with a scenario where you have an organizational culture, but as a result of not finding a synergy and alignment between individual interests or individual interests and individual goals, there's a disconnect between the direction of the organization and what sometimes directorate level or office level or organizational level interest is. So that leads into the development of these cultures within cultures. And that level of complexity also adds up to decision making. It gets into even how you analyze data, how you collect the data. So then the complexities just keep getting up and up and up and up. And so I didn't really respond to his challenge, but I actually increased the complexity of the question that Steve asked. And it's an interesting one for us to get into.
Moses, in poker, we say you saw me and you raised me.
I just increased the complexity of your question, Steve. So to begin with, I think we have to really bring the needs of the individual to the table, Steve, if I may go there. I think you started getting into it. And that's how you proactively prevent a scenario where you have cultures within cultures. We don't become a monster to really shift or adjust or solve problems.
Well,
yes.
Moses, I'm looking, at least on my screen, to your right, and everything's a little backwards. Diane has had a job where she's been a human resources leader, a people leader of 300,000 individuals who also come together under a brand and under a mission. So I'd love to hear, Diane, what you think about this, the needs of the person and the needs of the organization as it's all changing.
Yeah, look, I think social technology has completely changed the game. It used to be that the decisions were made by the experts and everyone else sort of, had to sort of genuflect because the experts had made the decision. Now we can all be involved and it's democratized decisions, particularly decisions that matter to people, right? So if, for example, your healthcare plan, maybe there are aspects of the healthcare plan you didn't like. Well, now you can be part of designing it, right? The whole organization can be part of it because you can actually run that. And I think it just gives agency to more people, but it also brings so many different perspectives into a decision that maybe the experts didn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of questions that came in from the audience, and I think they're particularly relevant. So, Elizabeth, thank you for posing this question. How do you ensure that the culture and values are consistent from top-level executives to the entry-level managers? That's a tough one. Who wants to take that?
I can jump in. I have a so I think there's the kind of problem with some organizations is that as you move up in the organization, you are less and less accountable. This should be the opposite. The more accountable or the more senior you are, the more accountable you should be, because that you have more impact on whether you do things effectively or not. This is like why, for example, your manager may give you a review and your review of your manager should be just as valid. This is almost, a crime in some organizations, or perceived to be one. But it's interesting to see how behavior changes and you get more demonstrated empathy between a manager and employee, which I think is good. And even if it's a little forced, it's still better than no empathy at all, I'd argue. So that means that, senior leaders should be sharing their information, their aggregate ratings, maybe not in the individual level, but their aggregate ratings with the people below them, just as much as people in the senior levels have the right to see the performance reviews or whatever it may be for lower level employees. I think this is leads to a much more fair and pleasant working experience. And considering you spend a good portion of your life working, I don't think it's a bad idea to somewhat upgrade the status of working a little bit. So that's one thing, is to have kind of a two-way street when it comes to performance, and as opposed to just a one-way top-down model.
That's a really, really great point. I would say there are two things that really make a difference. One is transparency. And look, if you see, we're seeing this all the time. People today, which a few years ago wouldn't have happened, are resigning because certain things about them or their decisions or their personal behavior has come to light, and it wouldn't have come to light in the old days, but because we're all on social media, we can all see it, right? And so the chances of there being a disconnect is less than it used to be, for sure. People get called out all the time. And so, so there's no hiding anywhere. That's number one. And then number two is this concept that you just talked about, Jordan, which is this feedback loop that, for example, if you're a leader and you've just done an engagement survey and people have said what they think about their leader, what they'd like to see changed, all of that stuff, the manager then needs to sit down. This is part of the routine at IBM. They sit down with their team and say, hey, this is the feedback I got on my leadership. And I want to talk with you about what I learned, what I'm going to do differently. I want you to help me with this, and call me on it, right? But it's a frank discussion, because leadership really matters. And if you're not leading in a way that's working for your employees, then you're not there as a leader for them. So to have that feedback loop that works, as Jordan said, both ways is really, really important.
Beth, can I jump in with a question? What Diane said reminded me of something. So one of the things we like to do at school is tell stories about our background. I promise everybody this won't be a long story, but what Diane said reminded me, when I was a psychology intern, I had gotten a couple of years of graduate school and I went to intern in New Haven. I remember calling my advisor and he said, "How are things going?" And I said, on a given day when things are status quo, I remember everything I learned in graduate school. Everything was cool. And, I'm kind of self-realized and yada, 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 right? But in a tough day when it all hits the fan, boy, it's hard to remember the way I'm supposed to think. So I'm wondering, for my friends and colleagues on the panel, when we talk about crises and disruption, how well are we able to keep to our leadership styles, our use of technology, our rational use of data, being open to our people? What happens when things really rev up?
Yeah. So, is it okay if I go first?
Yes.
This is an interesting question, and often go to the baseline of the institutional setup or the organization in question. There are certain organizations that have an advantage because they are structured in a way that they deal in an environment of disruptions. And of course, we haven't defined disruptions, but I'll take your calling on disruptions as something that interferes with the normally designed processes and how things are supposed to happen. So if we go by that baseline definition, there are institutions out there, and I can call on mine as one of them, that we do experience disruptions. We have structures, in the case of, say, agility being one element, and how we absorb disruptions. So you may have setups, how you allow risk to inform how you make decisions. There are organizations out there that do this very well. And so when big things happen, when they are kind of shifted a little in one way or the other, you already have the inherent flexibility and the elements in place, the mechanics of adjusting right back or managing disruptions. Then you have organizations that are rigidly set in place. They have no clue. And so when disruptions take place, disruptions of any scale or any scope, it can be market disruptions. It can be a COVID-19 derived sort of disruptions. And then they have no know-how because they don't have those fundamental institutional flexibilities, agility, and decision-making processes to allow them to survive or even to thrive within those environments. So it really goes to the core before we even talk about individuals. And how they deal with disruptions.
Jordan, you look like you had something to add before. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to a different question.
Yeah, no, the only thing I was going to say is, and I think it kind of aligns just to try to hit a few of the comments I see popping up around transparency and how some of that's understood. Diane hit the nail on the head in the values piece, the focus that we're starting to see organizations take now around diversity, both in terms of the workforce and everybody just relentlessly pursuing those values from so many different angles is what's driving the innovation around this. But ultimately, there's still a lot of decisions that get made. And I think through a couple of examples that are out there in terms of how people drive that transparency, again, kind of going back to that intent-based leadership approach, it's kind of interesting to see hundreds of years of just naval tradition. I remember sitting here at the Naval Academy in Annapolis at the Leadership Laboratory, as they call it, wondering, when am I ever going to see or use this stuff? And then you start seeing it even in some of the most cutting edge organizations that are out there as well, too. One that many have tried to copy, as just one case example, is the Spotify rhythm model. Many have failed in copying it because, unfortunately, the context of your organization, it has to fit that organization. But the one thing they did really well is they actually developed a framework for the organization to have arguments, how to have productive arguments, and how to broadcast the small bets and the big bets within the organization that each of the different levels of the organization were tracking and paddling towards as a self-organizing group. So I think those are types of ways to drive some of that transparency around it. And Moses' own team, we don't have time to go to it all here, but I've always been enamored with the Cassini mission, Moses, for Saturn, right? I mean, they couldn't come to agreement across so many different stakeholder groups of science, engineering, and everybody else. And they finally developed almost, and people are going to think I'm a degenerate gambler, I think, after this, talking about bets so much, but they came up with a way to specifically map the trade-offs and actually negotiate. If I have a little more science budget weight restriction over here, I got a trade-off over there. And then they would almost become a negotiation style of decision-making, but it was transparent, above board, and everybody knew what the end mission was that they were heading towards. I think those are two great examples in that area.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We have a question that came in from our audience, from Kent. Kent, thank you so much for this question. It's really tying in with this conversation. This is the question. I'm a data-driven person as well. How do you circle the troops when there's a disconnect between the emotional side or unconscious bias and the data?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I actually respond. I was
actually questions.
And electroshock is off the table.
I actually I did a very short response in the YouTube comment section, but part of it is that a little bit of the cultural factors is that, one, if you bring data and people start to question it, that's a fair discussion. It doesn't nullify it. The only way to nullify it is to have better or different data, and that often will reduce the amount of sort of objections for objection's sakes, and actually puts that, well, I got to put a little bit of work into it to make my point. Is it that good of a point? You know, and that's actually an important. That's actually kind of important. It's instead of arguing with something, you say, "Can you do it better?" That's like the data version of that, and that seems to. And every once in a while, you'll run into someone who does have better data. They will put in the time and effort, and it's amazing. And you know, you just got one up, and that's fine as long as it's better.
Yeah, and I think that's
so here's my challenge with data-driven decision making. Right, the question I was asked about emotions, and I'll equate emotions to human beings. And the human being is a very, very complicated and complex organism. So we've been talking about the human being in the course of decision making. If you allow data to drive certain decisions divorced or devoid of the emotional input that are often very hard to capture as data points, you have a problem. And so I think where this is going is maybe the way we look at this is, how do we really get those human emotions that are often very hard to quantify or very hard to capture in the form of data, zeros and ones? How do we really accurately represent those human emotions and get them to influence or override certain data-driven decisions? Because let's face it, you may have data points or quantified values pointing in a certain directions, and one or just a couple of human emotions saying otherwise, in my opinion, will have to override some of those data points as to how you define data in that context, by the way, Ben. So I really want us to look at this question very carefully, because it's loaded. We have human beings in question when we talk about emotions. Yes.
Absolutely. And thank you. And that's so interesting. I want Jordan to weigh in on this, because I have heard Jordan say that he draws a distinction between what he calls data and what he calls vision. And no one would say that data doesn't matter. But Jordan, I've heard you say that you're inclined to temper your reliance on data with what you call vision. So what is vision in this context? Who has it? And how do you know it when you see it?
Yeah, I think that's a key point, right? And it's not that much different than what Ben's saying. I mean, Ben's combating data with data, and what I hear from my different, varying perspective is, you have to have a leader that has the courage to challenge their own preconceived notions, dispositions, and have the authenticity to say, I'm changing my mind, right? Jeff Bezos has instilled some great leadership principles for the Amazon organization, roughly 14 of them that they live and die by. And my favorite one is that leaders are right a lot. And on the surface, many misunderstand that, right? And think, oh, that must mean that they hire instinctually brilliant people that just get it right on the first try every time. No, it's people that are willing to say, you know what, new information has come to light, consistent like with what Ben's saying, data combating data, that, you know what, we are asking the wrong question. And yes, we have data for that, but that data is confirming the answer to the wrong question, the wrong direction we need to go. I've seen some examples just with organizations we've worked with, membership-based, that would be able to have beautiful data analytics programs that would predict when membership was going to churn. And they'd send a communication to try to capture them on the back end to make sure that they didn't lose them at that renewal stage. And the analytics would subsequently predict whether or not, if somebody was high risk in that area, it would send them a little gift to go with it for the high risk ones. And the hypothesis was, you know what, if we send that gift out, it's going to minimize the churn and we're going to retain them. the question was wrong, right, in that regard, because what they ended up finding out was they were asking the wrong thing. The data might have shown that there was risk of churn. There was no data to show whether the gift actually retained anybody. And they kept digging in and following that path, probably to excessive cost. And I think the thing that's important to remember when defining vision is that data alone, and to quote our good colleague Larry Prusak, I think he said it best across the IKNS program, as kind of the foremost mind in all things knowledge for those that aren't in the knowledge management area. Data itself is just inert and ambiguous. The more data we generate, whether it's through social channels, work channels, enterprise software platforms, whatever it might be, requires even more human interaction with it, because there has to be a level of reflection and introspect to it in terms of, are we asking the right question? Are we on the right course? Are we validating our assumptions? Are we disproving them? And do we need to change direction? That's what falls into the vision bucket.
I'm glad
that's really well said. I think Kent asked a question about unconscious bias, which I think is huge, right? In what you just described, because you don't know that you don't know your biases. That's the whole point about unconscious. So you've got to keep validating it. I had a situation at IBM where we did that, where we did hackathons to hire developers, and it was cool and it was fun and it was great. But the problem was the men were doing better than the women in the hackathon. So we went ahead and hired women anyway. But 2 years later, we said, well, how did they do relative to people who did well on the hackathon? And sure enough, you probably guessed this, they did just as well, regardless of how they did on the hackathon. And once you go into it, you go, well, why do the men do so much better on the hackathon? And the answer, if you dig in, is, well, they grew up on games, and because they learned early on how to do games on their computers, they were just faster, and there weren't the same great computer games for girls, and so they didn't have that experience. So when you dig in deep enough, you can find that unconscious bias. But sometimes we just get carried away by something that seems cool and something that looks like it's there's no bias at all.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear Diane say that, because I was going to go a little bit countercultural. I'm all for data. Let's go on record for that. We teach human capital analytics, but the data is only going to go so far. It's going to be an input. We got to trust relationships, culture, innovation, risk, learning as we go, seat of the pants. Interested to hear more about the notion of vision. So I look at data, as I said, as one piece of the puzzle, and I'm sure we all do. But it's the other part that we build in organizations and in cultures and in interpersonal relationships and in measurement and in continuous learning that I think take us the distance. And we're never going to get to 100% certainty anyway.
And Beth, one thing I would say is Diane and I talked about before this as well too, is something that data can't do. A great piece of work is from MIT, from Tom Malone. And a lot of people come to myself, and I see my colleague Ed in the comment section asking, why do some teams absolutely crush it and some teams end up in the ditch? And they've got the same cookie cutter resume, fruit salad after their last name, certifications, education, and everything else, but we have this performance variability. And when he did that study, he tried to find out why some teams are more successful than others. One was teams that participate more, not just dominated by one or two in the group. Makes total sense. We all nod our head along with that. Teams that ultimately are able to read the mind through the eyes. So they covered up everybody's face, so you could only see the eyes. And by reading some of the emotion from people and being able to have that kind of empathetic approach, which feeds a lot of the human-centered design alignment, caused more success for the team from a causality standpoint. The third one was teams with more women. And I know we missed International Women's Day here by a couple of days, but I still feel like it's perfect timing for this, right? Teams with more women, not a certain ratio or number, but just sheer volume of more women performed. And the reason why was because of number two. They were better at reading the mind through the eyes, right? So with that being said, there was no data sets or anything to groom through. It was actually reading the human component for the team performance, and that was driving the outcome. So it's probably why, as a Navy man married with 2 daughters, I take orders very well, but I've conceived the notion that the future is female. So sign me up.
that all sounds wonderful.
Regarding emotion, we've actually used. I was going to say we've used emojis before. Like, how does this make you feel? We did a huge panel of like the 100 different emojis, and it's actually pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good a battery of emotions there.
So since we are in an era of data analytics, and this is maybe a plug for Columbia as a whole, as a university, as an institution of higher learning, I think we really need to understand data. My takeaway from this brief conversation is that data still has a role. Data analytics is still powerful. But we really need to understand data in its right context and its limitations and its application points. And how far can we take data? And oh, by the way, how data relates to human beings and decision making. And perhaps it's out there. But often we get this little sort of data analytics is packaged in a way as data will solve all problems. And often that's what the issue is. So this is really important maybe for institutions of higher learning to start looking at data again, how we treat data, how we present data, how we collect data, and how we actually even talk about data analytics. This is a very good conversation.
It is. We could spend the whole day on this conversation because it's so interesting, but I have some very interesting questions coming in from the chat, from our audience that I want to share with you, okay? The first one is from Dario. How do you balance speed and taking time to gather information when making decisions? That's a phenomenal question. Who wants to take a stab at that?
I would argue we've got a good juxtaposition here with Ben and Moses, right? Ben, we've talked about this before, but it comes down to the risk profile, right? Moses has an extreme environment, putting people in space and sending people on a multi-month duration trip to Mars from a project that has spanned horizons and entire careers, right? For people to do it. And Ben's got digital capitalism without capital that he can tweak the feature on YouTube tomorrow and flip it back in 3 seconds. No loss of life, right, Ben? At least I don't think you've lost anybody.
Right. Nothing at YouTube blows up like a rocket. I'll give you that.
So speed is important, but it has to be calculated speed. I'm joking, but there's truth to it. Agility, like my earlier comment about agility in terms of decision making. Speed is important, but we have the benefit. If you remember the project lifecycle, we have the benefit of reviews. And so within the environment that I work at NASA, we really take our reviews very seriously. Why do we take our reviews very seriously? Because it allows us to do something called pulse. We call them review gates, entrance gates, exit criteria. We have a set of metrics, a set of expectations that we go in and look for those things. So no matter how fast you go, how slow you go, when you get to a review gate, you have to pause. You have to stop. And peers and superiors and experts will come in. Those that, so to speak, sometimes do not have a dog in the race. They will come in at that particular review gate and ask pointing questions to find out if you're ready to proceed to the next phase, to go through that specific review gate. And so speed is important, but it's measured speed. So that at the end of the day, when we get to where we have to launch, we'll be able to say, we've worked out all the risks, we've done all the tests, we've done all the verification and validation requirements of the system. And so we are ready. We can confidently stand behind this system and say it's not going to blow up, it's going to go. Having done our humanly possible, systems engineering-wise possible. And so, yeah, that's what I can say about that. So speed is great, agility is helpful, but you still have to be very, very careful at why are you going fast in the first place? And have carefully planned review gates to pause and check progress and check what you've accumulated so far. And if you are ready to really proceed, or if you went too fast, and so you've missed certain critical items, and so you have to go back and rework things.
I would say sometimes, though, there's no acceptance of a pause, right? For some things, right? I think the world demands a level of speed that maybe didn't exist 10 years ago, and if you don't respond quickly, then you look guilty, and so there's a need for corporations to develop a muscle around speed, and the only way you develop it is through trust. And if you've got a lot of what Ben talked about, right? How do you debate? How do you learn and build a consensus view of things before bad things happen, so that you can respond really, really quickly? But when we think about, for example, all the #MeToo decisions that had to be made really fast by companies, and the ones that were slow, oh my goodness, they were in huge trouble. So it's really, really important that a company be prepared for fast decisions to respond to what the world expects of them, what society expects of them.
That's exactly right, Diane. And I want to tie this to a question that just came in from an audience member named Wen. And this ties in with this desire and drive for, very fast decision making. And
what one wants to know is, how do we train employees to make good decisions under pressure? Because that's really when you're making that kind of quick decision, you are under pressure. So how do we train employees to make good decisions under pressure?
I would say experience, coaching, and tolerance. So give them the chance to do it. Tell them when they're right, when they're wrong, and how, and don't beat them up for it. Sounds simple, but that's the way to do it. My background as a clinical psychologist, we used to do morning rounds in the ER after having to make very tough decisions in the middle of the night about psychiatric patients. And there was a culture there that we could learn, but we weren't second guessed. So we could have made the wrong decision, but we were helped to understand why. And that was so formative in my career, because I understood that, I can make a mistake. I need to have all the information back to the data. I need to have the experience. I need to keep learning, but I'm not going to get tripped up by somebody I work with.
I'd argue a little bit of both of things have been said before. One is having the data available makes decisions faster. If you have to wait for approval or you have to wait for something to be collected in the first place, you're not going to make a decision fast. And if you do, you didn't come with enough information. The second piece is, if you make a decision and it's wrong, you should be able to show your work on how you got there. I think that's important, because it not necessarily do like math problems and and show people your work, but literally say, here's what I had access to at the time, and if I had had access to this, I might have been better. And then again, like was mentioned before, not punishing people for that. If you have open data and have enough vision to collect the right data before it's needed, and that's to Jordan's point about vision, because you can't use data that's not collected in the first place. So I'd argue that it's speed comes from a factor of planning and tolerance, and then you can let people go be quite autonomous on their own making decisions, as long as they learn from it. And honestly, it's like sometimes we call it a postmortem. What something went wrong, why? And it's not a blame game. Anyone who gets blamed, or is anyone who starts blaming, is the blame, right? And the idea is to make sure that everyone knows how, if this thing happened right now again, how we would get it right, and reward people for admitting that they didn't have what they needed, or that the decision was made in the wrong way, instead of punishing them.
Yeah, right. And to Ben's point on that, I think going back to kind of what started some of this around how do we train people for this and everything else, right? Peter Drucker has got some good thinking on this, but it's that fundamental premise that good management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. So how do you make that discernment within the organization? So that's what I think opens up that example you had me open with, Beth, on the submarine, right? It's constant preparation, training, scenario driven. Any and all scenarios. What if this? What if that? We could knock out the most complex, crucial mission parameter that you could possibly imagine. High five everybody, and 30 seconds later, we're around a plot, hot washing it and breaking it down to what we could have what could have done better next time. What did we expect? What did we assume? What didn't go the way we thought it did? How do we capture those lessons learned and make them actionable? And I think that, to Ben's point, the autonomy piece is key. I think the future of work is Dr. Ed Hoffman and I lead that coursework, is all based on intangibles. And I think it's difficult to get data to recognize the intangibles that are driving roughly 85 to 90% of the value in organizations today. And I think that's where it's at. And I think being able to actually measure the ability to reflect from a human standpoint in terms of how some of these decisions are made, or what's going to be the competitive advantage, if you will, as those transient advantages that Rita McGrath in the B School talks about quite a bit. We can instill all the technology and all the data analytics platforms tomorrow, and we do a stepwise jump to a new level of productivity. The competitive advantage is going to be how we humanize that through the intangibles and the reflection and applying it as a leader.
Yeah, and Beth, I just briefly want to go back to the tolerance just for a moment. Let's remember, we're a school, we're a university. I like to tell people, we don't teach, we coach. So building it, helping people learn, helping people grow their careers, that's all about, okay, you're confused. It's a mistake. Let's work through it.
Yeah, I would say one of the great things that you learn in courses like the ones you teach, Steve, is a mental frame for how to deal with the unknown, right? And if no one would have dealt with a pandemic before, but if they're in a position where they have to make a decision about whether to send people home or whether someone can go to, God forbid, a conference. Those decisions had to be made, and they had to be made by people who had a mental frame about how to make decisions about very ambiguous, lack of data kind of situations. And that is the great value, I think, of an education where you're living in the shoes of different leaders as you hear about and learn about how they made decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just want us to quickly respond to one more audience question because it really ties in with everything we're saying here. This is from Francis. And Francis would like to know, which humans do the panelists go to for advice when decisions are really hard?
Wow.
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you, Francis, for this question. Which humans do you go to for advice when a decision is really hard?
So this is more and more I'm going to my kids. I have adult children. They know some things that I don't know. They have perspectives that I don't have. They come to me too. But I'm relying on them more because they're seeing things a little bit differently. And thankfully, we have a good relationship. They can tell me some stuff other people won't tell me.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to deviate slightly from this question. I go to two people for one reason, what you just talked about. And the key word here is trusted. I have a trusted mentor that has basically walked my path. So I go to this mentor who is advanced in age than I am, experienced than I am, professional experience that wise. Then I go to a younger person that I'm actually mentoring age-wise. So I go to two people for my trusted data point to help me when I face it. And then, of course, then I'll trade the ideas and do my trades and draw what is the Moses decision and then proceed from that standpoint. Yeah.
I can go next. I go to the internet and I post the idea that I think is best, because if you're wrong, the internet will let you know very quickly.
Crowdsourcing and shame.
Exactly. You have to, but it works.
Yeah,
I would say crowdsourcing is what I've done as well. I just feel like there's the wisdom of the crowd has been really, really helpful to me on some issues. Just, saying, hey, I want to run this by you. What do you think? And people will tell you gladly. So that's one. And I think also having a network is really important, a trusted network of peers, people who are more junior, people who are more senior. But having that network that you can draw on, well, partly because you need people who aren't going to think you're crazy and you trust and they trust you.
Yeah,
Thank you all. And I
agree.
Wait, Jordan, you weighed in, right? Yes?
No, good to go. I agree with Diane. Like I said, having a network even beyond your organization, just to benchmark somebody outside the box, so to speak, that might be in a completely unrelated area. They just have a new way of looking at things. Would be the only thing I add. I think that's key. And the only thing I would say to Francis's question is, it scratches at one thing, which is who do you go to? I always try to go to the team closest to the problem again, right? That's just a naval thing. You get out, you walk the boat, you try to talk to the people that are closest to the action. To Ben's point on the data access, it's who's asking the question. If they don't have access to the data, we're doing it wrong. That's a good indicator. And I think I notice in organizations I work in is that it can be an indicator for the culture as well too. I saw a lot of people would, oh my gosh, did you talk to Jordan? You need to copy me and copy my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss before you talk to Jordan about that, right? And that is like, okay, great, I got my problem solved, but now I found a new one and I'll work on that.
Exactly. Oh, thank you. Unfortunately, this is all that we have time for. We could do this all day, all weekend. I think that you should all do a retreat and we'll run it through SPS. And I am sure we will blast out enrollments because this is so interesting. So I want to thank our fantastic panel for their insights. I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight. And our next Frame Your Future event will be responding to shock on Monday, March 15th at 8 a.m. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.